for speaking with us today. So to start, I'll just introduce Richard, then I'll pass it back over to the two experts and speakers here today. So Richard is the author of The Art of Sanctions, senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia. Richard most recently served as the Deputy Special Envoy for Iran in the Biden-Harris administration. He previously served as Principal Deputy Coordinator for Sanctions Policy at the Department of State and in a variety of other positions in the US government. So with that, I'll pass it over to Richard and let him introduce Olivia.
Great, thanks very much. Thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks very much for having me and having Olivia join you here today. So to introduce Olivia Lazard is a visiting scholar at the Carnegie Europe Foundation. Her research focuses on the geopolitics of climate, the transition ushered by climate change, and the risks of conflict and fragility associated with climate change and environmental collapse. Olivia is an environmental peacemaking and mediation practitioner, as well as a researcher. She has over 12 years of experience in peacemaking sector at field and policy levels. With an original specialization in the political economy of conflicts, she's worked for various NGOs, the UN, EU, and donor states in the Middle East, Latin America, Sub-Saharan, North Africa, and parts of Asia. So we're gonna spend a lot of our conversation talking a little bit about the current difficulties presented in the energy transition, particularly with what's going on right now in the Russia situation. So let me start off with that. You know, Olivia, can you give us a little bit of a sense of your thinking about what the potential consequences of the Russia sanctions are on the energy transition and the general environment here, particularly as relates to the effects on democratic governance?
Thank you, Richard, and thank you for inviting me. I'm quite happy to be here. So we can think of the sanctions in different ways. The obvious thing is that it added essentially some inflationary pressures to various commodities, including on fossils, which is having a number of effects beyond the weaponization of fossils by Russia in the first place. So at a sort of European level, there's a lot of discussions, as everybody knows, about how to redesign essentially the energy mix within Europe, how to accelerate the transition, how to try and wean European countries as quickly off of Russian fossils as possible. And that has a number of different consequences in terms of reconfiguration over other types of dependencies with other actors, or, you know, kickstarting essentially some production of fossil energy also back in Europe. So one of the very key effects, which predated a little bit the invasion of Ukraine, but accelerated quite largely as a result of the invasion, was indeed just kickstarting again with the use of coal, for example. Which is not going to bode very well at a time when, you know, the EU is trying to position itself as a leader on the energy transition, and is certainly not going to bode very well in terms of the EU's relationship with partners in the so-called global south, where there's a lot of pressure to try and push countries that are still coal dependent on the large part outside of the use of this fossil. But beyond that, there is a number of issues as a result of the sanctions and, you know, the crisis and the weaponization of fossils essentially on inflationary pressures in Western Europe and across Europe, which is having a secondhand and indirect effect on the transition in Europe, because the more we can just look at the French election at the moment, the campaign. The main theme has become, once again, the issue of purchasing power. So on the French landscape, climate transitions and energy transitions have never been very strong, especially compared to Germany. But at this point, it's very, very clear that climate is very much relegated to, you know, a back burner. It's just not really present. What is, you know, the issue is therefore, how will we make sure that the lower parts or the most vulnerable parts of the population are not affected too heavily in terms of their purchasing power, are not affected too heavily in their mobility, particularly knowing that Russian gas is used for private home consumption for a lot of, you know, for a huge part. So now we're seeing, you know, discussions about how to introduce subsidies for fossil, you know, at the consumption, at the consumerist level, and how we can essentially sort of, you know, lessen the impact of the inflationary pressures, rather than having a conversation that really focuses on how can we increase and accelerate the subsidies, for example, for home isolation, for heat pumps, for all this type of other alternatives that are necessary. So the question then becomes, where are the political pressure systems and what are they trying to do? But also, are the right structures and incentives in place at an economic level to really accelerate the subsidies in the right direction? So I think that the first thing that comes to mind is very much around this notion of democratic resilience and democratic support for the transition in Europe at a time when essentially from an economic standpoint everything is going to be a lot more difficult, and the whole sort of dream about liberal democracy and how to sort of move into green growth is going to lose a bit of its veneer, and therefore it's going to be more difficult for democratic leaders to push that in that direction. So the short-term decisions are going to have to be weighed in against the long-term objectives, and at the moment the short-term decisions speak a lot more to how to reconfigure fossil dependencies rather than really sort of move ahead towards the energy transition in an accelerated way. But there are also some structural reasons about that.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, I think one of the tensions that I've kind of perceived here and really kind of wondered why it's not getting a little bit more play, particularly in Europe. I mean, there's some discussion of it here in the United States as well, but it's the degree to which being dependent on Russia for energy resources, has got two negative effects. One, it means that you're vulnerable to these sorts of disruptions, which is obviously not ideal. Then, second, it means that there is subsidization of let's be frank here, a dictator and the dictator's ability to do things like launch a land war in Europe. So, one could argue very easily, I think, that the energy transition is actually the best way of defanging these sorts of situations in the future. And I'm curious as to your reaction and A, and B, the degree to which that might be the way we see people start to speak about the messaging, especially if the energy transition comes under some degree of attack.
So this is the message, right? So if you look at the latest communications from the EU Commission, particularly regarding this new plan called Repower EU, it is a very strong show of force at the level of the European Commission, and there is a very strong level of unity within Europe at the moment, at the highest political level, to say, let's move ahead with the transition as fast as possible. It is one way to make sure that we actually go towards this notion of strategic autonomy that the French presidency has been putting forward as a political model for the EU. Now we need to think in, again, short-term, long-term, and then structural hurdles. So short-term is we can't electrify all the grids from one day to the next. We need to very much sort of, plan this ahead, and the EU has been planning this for a while. We have, a full set of legislative packages that are still going through, the parliament that need to be voted in motion, et cetera, et cetera. But we were already on our way. Now, the question is how to accelerate even more. So there are two discussions to differentiate here. One is, how do we accelerate weaning Europe off of Russian fossils? And how do we accelerate the energy transition? And the two are now becoming related. On the short term, weaning Europe off of Russian fossils mean, well, we need to rearrange other types of dependencies. So all of a sudden, Europe is now turning to Qatar and to the United States in order to gain, some kind of resilience were Russian gas, for example, to be cut off from one day to the next, which is a possibility. That has consequences in terms of, again, the type of dependency incentives that Europe is playing upon. So reinforcing, for example, the LNG lobby in the US is not going to play in favor of the global transition because, well, the US is a very central component of how global transitions are going to move about. And if the gas lobby stays very strong over there, then it's going to create some tensions in collective and solidarity transitions. In terms of the structural move towards an energy transition, which is towards renewable, we have different options. That's part of the energy mix that we're considering in Europe. One of the key things, and it's been quite an earthquake actually particularly in the German landscape, which is still under discussion, is that collectively Europe is now thinking more seriously about extending the life of nuclear plants, for example, and resorting back to nuclear energy as a stronger part of the energy mix. We'll see how that plays out, and we'll see what kind of relationships between different countries it creates, both within Europe, but also between Europe and other countries. Now, the renewable part of energy, which is indeed sort of wind farms, solar, and electricity, we have to take another element into account, which is the hidden part of the story. And that's where Europe is unfortunately stuck between a rock and a hard place there. In order to move towards those renewable energies, we need to have effective, reliable, and already active supply chains in terms of critical materials. Those critical materials are, for the most part at the moment, located and extracted and processed in China. The European Union is over 90% dependent on China for, actually, if we think about it this way, for its energy transition, the green and clean type. Because of the strings attached to being dependent on China, there has been a strong push to diversify supply chains. It is a complicated thing because within Europe, there are some deposits of different critical materials, lithium, borate, rare earths, but there is a lot of push against the opening of mines because they're very extractive intensive. They create a lot of pollution and environmental degradation. So mines are not very active to meet the European demand in terms of European supply. Where the mines are most active are in Finland and in Sweden, but not to the level that it can satisfy all of European supplies. So that means that we have to look elsewhere. We have to look in the neighborhood. And one of the things, for example, that is quite peculiar, if not quite suspicious, is that the European Union had struck a strategic partnership with Ukraine in July 2021 over opening up a number of mines about critical materials in Ukraine, and bringing Ukraine into the economic processing and the supply chain diversification and the economic dividend diversification of Europe as part of its transition. If not Ukraine, then we need to look at Serbia, which is also a fairly unstable country where Russia is very active. If not Serbia or in this neighborhood, we need to look even more, like abroad. And we're looking at places, for example, at the Central African Republic, where Wagner, for example, and Lobai, an extractive company, which is also very strongly connected to the Kremlin, are active. They have gained very large land concessions and mining concessions. They had completely locked in the security landscape to the advantage of the Russian counterparts and to the disadvantage of a lot of Central Africans themselves. We're also seeing all of a sudden Mali and Mozambique, like all of these places where a number of Russian actors are active at the moment. And if you look at this type of pattern, then you see essentially that there are a lot of theaters which are already invested geopolitically. It's not just Russians, it's also Chinese actors that are trying to gain access to all of the critical supply chains that any region of the world serious about its own energy transitions need to be active with. And so all of a sudden, the picture that we're seeing is that actors in Russia are playing on different types of dependencies for the future. We're looking for the moment at the weaponization of fossils, but we're also looking at a situation where Russia is trying to become an economic power broker in the supply chains of the energy transition, which creates, therefore, a number of difficulties for how the EU can structurally move towards its own energy transition in a way that, is indeed about strategic autonomy, is indeed about using the energy transition as a way to de-weaponize, relationships, or to detoxify relationships, and to really move into something which is clean. So that's the reason why I'm talking about a hard and rock place, because there is political will to move towards a clean energy transition in Europe. There is a will to better connect European grids. There is a will also to go outside of the 27 and to look at how to bring the Western Balkans, for example, and the electrification of the grids. But in order to do that, we're going to have to be very careful about, again, the type of dependency relationships that we may buy into, that we may enter into, and what kind of consequences it has for Europe, but also for the countries concerned. particularly regarding their own fragility, if there are, like these battles around geopolitical scramble for resources or spheres of influence. So the European Union needs to think of its own transition, not just as a matter of urgency for energy security and energy sovereignty or autonomy, but very much also in terms of geopolitics and having a strong value proposition over how to create economic dividends as part of the energy transition and as a way to redistribute wealth, as a way to equalize relationships and to strengthen also the resilience of countries concerned by the energy transition, the extraction part, against geopolitical scrambling. And that's a whole new level that the EU hadn't seen coming for a while.
Yeah, what's interesting is that's where there's potentially going to be some overlap with the sanctions campaign that's underway and that will be underway. Mentioning Wagner Group, for instance, and mentioning some of these other Russian actors. I mean, I highly suspect that sometime in the next several weeks, if not sooner, that there's going to be expansion of sanctions to target some of these actors, especially particularly in the mining sector, for instance, and some of the oligarch activity that we see there. And so what strikes me, and I'd be curious as to your thinking about this, given your experience out there in the field, is whether or not right now it's a problem, the degree to which Russia and to maybe a lesser extent China are seeking to monopolize some of these resources out there in the world. But there is also potential opportunity here, depending on how we structure both our engagement and cooperation. And it strikes me that if the U.S. and the EU were to work together to find ways of both, resourcing and setting up resource utilization from these places, but to do so in the right way, right, through measures that are preventing corruption, for instance, and avoiding some of the exploitation that can otherwise come along with it. But that's a real potential opportunity, even to for once maybe do some of this a little bit right. So I'd be curious as you're thinking about how that might work. But before you answer, let me just also note, as part of my moderator responsibilities, we've only got another 13 minutes or so. So if you do have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box and I will turn to those promptly. But then please, Olivia.
I think you're right. I think that there is a question of what is the value proposition behind global supply chains today, because it's not just a matter of economic dividends. It is also a matter of, especially at a time of the IPCC report from 2 or 3 weeks ago told us that climate disruptions are coming faster. They're coming with greater impact, and they're going to impact very specifically, regions of Africa, the Indo-Pacific, and Latin America very strongly. And it's in all of those different regions of the world that we find the concentration of all the materials that are needed for the decarbonization and for the digitalization agenda. So then it becomes about what are the opportunities essentially for creating value on adaptation, on resilience building out of the energy transition. And there needs to be some conversations indeed happening within the EU itself, because obviously sort of trying to get 27 ducks in a row is always a bit of a trouble, as everybody knows, but hopefully also as a way to re-strengthen and renew the transatlantic partnership with a new vision, which is not just about, some economic dividends coming from globalization, which has come under a lot of stress and a lot of questioning, but really sort of using a political vision and a vision of security, also in climate disrupted futures, for how to renew economic partnerships. In this conversation, however, between Europe and the US, there needs to be some fine-tuning, because at the end of the day, the challenge that we're facing is one of where are the supplies, so where are the deposits or the active mining ventures that are already open, but particularly the deposits, because that's where everyone is looking. But to feed what kind of demand? And this is, at the end of the day, what is going to be the center of our conversation, or what should be the center of our conversation at a time when we're talking about climate justice as well. We need to urgently decarbonize various energy mixes in Europe, in the US. This needs to be the priority. If the priority shifts towards using the energy transition as an opportunity for the fourth industrial revolution, and therefore a new wave of economic growth, which, without having some reflections over how do we create particularly partnerships over recycling technologies, using waste, for example, and trying to step away from too much extractive industries in the global south, or in the European neighborhood, or even in the US and Canada for that matter, which are environmentally disruptive, which are often located on indigenous territory, which create a lot of issues around corruption, predation, human insecurity, and things like this. So the question then becomes, what is, again, the sort of the values that we're working towards? What kind of economic system does it underpin, and does it work to fuel, quite literally? And therefore, what are the ways in which we can stabilize demand and create new types of societal models on the basis of resilience, because this is, the main thing that we need to focus on, rather than, perpetual economic growth or things like this. What are the new economic trajectories that we can look into in order to support certain values that are socially, politically, and economically valuable, and which are also adaptive to the climate disruptions that are coming, and that serve the purpose of essentially de-escalating also geopolitical tensions, because at the moment we're seeing a lot of competition happening over how to gain fast, quick access to those materials to serve different types of transition models, which are pitted one against the other. So yes, to a transatlantic conversation about this, absolutely, which is not just about what kind of approach to have towards supply chains, but what supply chains feed into in terms of societal model and political and economic model.
Oh, that's interesting. It's part interesting because the question that we just got asked was what kind of links to this, really, and so I'll ask that question in a second. But I think the linkage that I see here is that right now we're trying to think about the ways in which we want to engage in governance and relationships with regard to some of these countries. But of course, there is going to be a country that is potentially still going to be there as a source for all these various different materials, and that being Russia itself. So the question is, do we see any place for engagement with Russia on energy transition uses in the future, and what can the EU do now to shape the form of that engagement? I'm going to put a caveat attached to that, which is we're making an assumption here that Vladimir Putin and/or people very much like Vladimir Putin are still in charge of Russia. So the easy way of saying, oh, if he's not there, then this is all easy. No. We have to deal with the possibility that this is a deal in which we're still dealing with a Putin-led regime. And how do we think we'll handle that, given the fact that one of the critiques really of the last 30, 40 years was this theory that relationships and trade and ties and things like that would eventually moderate Putin and make it so difficult for him to engage in conflict that because it would be so costly. Well, that's apparently not the case. So how do we want to try and see if we're going to engage with this guy and his government in the out years?
It's a really good question, and my very honest answer at the moment is I'm not sure. I don't know, because at the end of the day, what happened is that indeed, as you pointed out, there is a fundamental questioning of a very philosophical foundation, which was the more we embed relationships from an economic perspective, the less likely war is going to be. The reality, and it has been a deteriorating situation for over 10 years now, where it was not outright weaponization of fossils or economic relationships, but it was, like a sort of tug of war for a long time, and just tensions here and there, where it was constraining the political space and playing on divisions within the European Union. So now the question is going to be, if we disregard for the moment the fossil fuel element, and if we look at the resource endowment of Russia and Ukraine, for that matter, in those critical materials, then can the global economy still function? As was pointed out, the price of nickel completely skyrocketed to the point where actually it needed to be stopped. It needed to be artificially stopped. Palladium, the same thing. Neon, the same thing for steel processing and things like this. So the question becomes, okay, so can we substitute those resources that are coming out of Russia, either by opening up supply chains and establishing them with other partners in the world, wherever the deposits are? Can we substitute with other types of materials thanks to the technological research that is currently ongoing over how to create different types of product mixes or product compounds in order to keep on going with technological and digital innovation or electrification, playing on resource efficiency? Can we break into, a lot of business hurdles vis-a-vis the recycling of waste? We produce a ton of waste every year. We only recycle about 8% of it. There is a lot of business potential and investment potential in that. So these are questions, but at the end of the day, we also need to ask ourselves, this fundamental question of how do we deal with Russia, knowing that the trusting relationships have completely collapsed. This foundation, this philosophical foundation has been broken. So how is it possible to re-engage with Russia at some point as an actor that is, for all intents and purposes, a really important economy in the world, without risks of antagonization or weaponization of things like this, knowing that at the end of the day, and let's be very honest about this, and this is part of the conversation also with about sanctions, and I'd be happy to also hear your thoughts, Richard, about this, but you talk about the art of sanction. There is the right dose of sanctions to go for until Russia essentially sort of completely pivots outside of the European dependencies as well, and therefore look to other partners to create a different type of global economy. And then we would find ourselves in a world where there are potentially different financial systems, different global exchanges, and therefore there would be spheres of influence that are targeting all of the countries that are well endowed in those critical resources, but there would effectively also be just blocks that are not intent on pursuing relationships with one another, and therefore in any case creating a lot of competition and instability, and this needs to be avoided. So we do need to engage with Russia in the future. Asking this question today is, I think, adding too much to the plate of those trying to reconfigure dependency relationships. And as you're pointing out, we don't even know what happened with Putin. He was always a dictator, but he was somehow a reliable one, I suppose. And now all of a sudden it's completely disrupted in terms of behavioral patterns. So whether or not it's with Putin or not, the question will become, what are the strategies? How tiny, how big the steps? How can we reconstruct some kind of trusting relationship that is where the parameters are known? And over time, how do we detoxify a relationship, knowing that at the moment, Putin is one of the people who is quite intent on using the destabilizing factors of an energy transition, which is in any case going to be destabilizing in many different levels, and trying to use this to weaken the European Union, to break it from the inside out and outside in, and therefore try to reshape also the global balance of power. That's what is at stake, and this is what needs to be tackled first. Once there's a clarity over what kind of equilibriums we'll be coming out with, then we can start looking at how do we re-engage Russia, and who is Russia, and what is Russia.
Yeah, I think that's very, especially I'm attracted to the point you made about power blocks. I mean, my own philosophy on this and own theory on this is that we're actually moving to that kind of system in which there are much more likely to be blocks of global economies. There is going to be, one central one. And I think, it undercuts a couple of theories that people have put forward before, various different iterations, democratic peace or free trade peace and other such things, where, you could have these systems being, set up around the world, to try and integrate all this stuff. That tends to go away if you start to have these kinds of power blocks emerge, because states do decide they want to compete in a way that is potentially consistent with free trade, but only on their terms within their blocks. It's an interesting twist on what folks had long thought was at least a theory. And of course, that's deeply problematic when we're dealing with problems that do require international cooperation. You can't quite manage a climate change issue if you've got power blocks that are going to have completely different views, right? Have the ability and willingness to potentially sabotage one another, where they don't have a sense of common interest. I think we are getting the hook because I see us at 2:50. So I am not sure I am, but I'm looking up to see whether or not we're now done. So it looks like we are. So I want to thank you very much, Olivia, for joining me in this chat, and appreciate the opportunity to pick your mind a little bit.
Well, thank you very much for the questions from